This is Center Stage, putting your firm in the spotlight by highlighting business owners and other industry experts to help take your firm to the next level. Hey everyone, and welcome to Center Stage. I'm your host, John Henson, and this week, talking about some of the bigger mistakes, pitfalls to avoid when you're tackling the way that you're building your story, building the branding side of your marketing. And, we've talked before, branding is so much more than just like a logo, a color scheme, and a tagline. That, it's a bigger story, it's bigger messaging. And so to talk more with us about that, I have the founder of Storify, Seth Erickson, joining us. Seth, thanks for taking some time this week.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we jump in, what is Storify? Who is Seth? Why are we talking to you this week about just the things that we need to avoid with these branding mistakes?
Yeah, so Storify agency mostly works with startups and small businesses, but the central idea around our agency is that we use storytelling, and Storify is a word. Most people think it means it's like Shopify or Spotify, but Storify means to tell or narrate in story, and that's kind of the main thrust of our agency. We want to build brands through storytelling. We want to create copy that uses storytelling, and the biggest reason for that is that quite often people they give information and they think that is what they should be doing, right? Like if I give you all the information, then you'll be able to make a decision. But the reality is that the way that the information is given, how it's structured, the brain really only accepts it well in one way, and that's storytelling. And so just to kind of narrate this point, if I gave you, a set of numbers, 42, 6, 9, 33, 2, 7, and said, okay, what's the next number in the sequence? Maybe you're going to be an overachiever and try to figure out what that next number is. But the reality is you probably don't know, even though I've given you all the information. So what storytelling does is allows you to come back in and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then your brain goes, oh, there's a pattern there. I understand that pattern. I can pick that pattern up, and I know what the next step in the process is.
Right.
And so often, like you were talking about, mistakes that people make is they just give information, and because that information makes sense to them, they go, everybody should understand what I'm saying because I've given them all the information. So, so again, with storytelling, one of the mistakes you can avoid in creating copy or building your brand is to have a story, and then your customers will start to go, oh, I get why I should use you as opposed to somebody else, or I get why your thing is better than another thing. Because you organize the information in a way that the brain accepts it. And this is all based on neuroscience, over the last 20 years that's come in to say, here's why humans are always telling stories.
Right.
And we've been doing it since before we were painting on the inside of caves or had alphabets or anything. It was a way of passing information. And so, so that's kind of Storify. That's why we are the way we are.
Yeah, no, I love that. And, I think especially with our audience, lawyers and finance pros, they're typically very logic-based people. So like, to your point, they often give out information and they do it in a way where it's like, okay, this is how I understand it. So I think, my audience should understand it the same way. Whereas, I don't think a lot of times they realize that they're actually just speaking to other lawyers and financial pros who live in that world and speak that language. But when you're talking to, the people who are actually going to hire you, it's really more effective to take, a more emotional, to make more of an emotional connection. Why is that versus, trying to come at it logically?
Well, one, we don't actually make decisions logically. So what happens is what we call our conscience, right? Where we're like, I'm thinking these thoughts and whatnot. That's really about 5% of our brain activity.
Mhm.
The other 95% is happening in the subconscious. So the subconscious and the conscious cannot talk to each other, but the subconscious is like crunching all the numbers. It's going through everything. It's doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the background. And what the subconscious then does is kicks a feeling back to you. So I can't remember who said it, but basically, uh, in my book, I know who said it, but I can't remember right now.
No, I get that. I get
Uh,
that.
that basically we we get a feeling and then we justify that feeling based on logic. So this goes back to the idea of the gut feeling. Why do I feel good about this? Why do I feel bad about this? Like maybe you've been around somebody and you're like, there's nothing logically that I can understand, but I just get a bad vibe from this person, right? Well, that's your subconscious picking up on all kinds of cues,
Yeah.
crunching that information and sending a signal back to you that this person's dangerous or there's something off with this person. So that's where you get what we would call a gut feeling. And so buying decisions, whether it's hiring somebody or whatever, we go, we like this person, but that's an emotionally based decision. But we think we're rational, but we're not. So and really it has to do with the way that the brain is set up. Why it's set up that way, I have no idea. But
Mhm.
the other thing that's interesting is that without emotion, people don't take action. So there's a case study I use in my book where Antonio Damasio, who's a really well-known neuroscientist, has written a lot of books, talks about that he had these patients that had damage to the prefrontal cortex, which is where you make decisions. And
Yep.
these people seemed totally fine; they were normal. But when the guy in the case study went to the store, he would sit there for an hour looking at milk and couldn't make a decision about which milk to buy because um, he didn't have that. He didn't have, or sorry, I said decision making is actually emotion. He had no emotion about, I like this one better than that one. So he
Mhm.
just sit there and unable to do anything. So we also know that that emotion also drives how memory works. So if you have an event in your life that is driven by a strong emotion, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, you're much more likely to remember that event. Whereas day to day things that you just don't care about, like you walked outside and the weather was fine and you saw a butterfly or whatever and you went on with your day, you're not going to remember that. So emotion pushes memories from short term memory that essentially get cleaned out on a regular basis because your brain's trying to essentially save space. It's your short term memory is like RAM in a computer. And so when there's an emotional event attached to that short term memory, then it gets pushed back into your long term memory, and then you are able to recall that. So there's a bunch of things around emotion
Yeah.
that play into what emotion is doing. So
Yeah. So, how then can someone at least get started, at least kind of injecting some sort of emotional appeal into their messaging, into their story, even if it's super heavy logic based, like, I mean, for example, I think it's like, um, you know, business lawyers or family lawyers or whatever. It's like, hey, look, here's a problem you have. We can solve it. There's no real emotional connection there. How can you start to then inject some of those emotional appeals into that messaging?
right. Um, so just as a kind of a quick example, let's say you're an accident lawyer.
Mhm.
Well, you can talk about the accident, but what you can do is then dive deeper into the accident and say, do you remember the fear that you felt when that car was coming at you? Do you
Mhm.
remember the pain that you felt when that car hit you and your car, and your leg was trapped, right? You can start to move to those emotional trigger points and say, and basically have the person recall that, which actually does something called simulation, which is another interesting aspect to the neuroscience of how we basically simulate the world around us in our
Mhm.
brains while we're conscious. And this is why, like, you can go see a movie and essentially have 2 hours go by and be like, no time passed at all. And it's because the whole time while you're watching the movie, you're simulating yourself in that situation, and then going, what would I do in that situation? Your brain it's a survival mechanism. Your brain's trying to figure it out. Um, so I kind of went a little off track, but uh, speaking to the emotional aspects of the trauma or the injury, asking people just how they felt in that moment starts to take them back to that place. It starts to trigger the emotional aspects of whatever happened. Um,
Yeah.
and it's a much better way to access the emotional part of the brain, create that simulation, than it is to just say, okay, so you were in an accident. Would you like to sue that person? Right?
Right.
That's just
Yeah.
information.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I feel like, the default is to just go through the process rather than how any of it actually affects people. It's just, hey, here's what happened, here's what happens next. And it's just like almost a robotic sort of process to go through it.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the other studies that I looked at in the book was um, they they had somebody stand up, give a bunch of facts and figures about something that happened, right? Like it happened on this day at 3:32 p.m. Blah 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 blah, and it was all
Mm.
again just information. Um, and then they asked people to recount how much of that presentation they were able to remember, and the recall rate was like between 20 and 30%.
Mm.
So of all the information given, they were only able to, like let's say there was 10 pieces of information, they could only remember two or three. When somebody stood up, gave the same set of information, but wove it into a narrative, the retention rate was between 70 to 80%. So again, this just points to you need to weave a narrative in a specific order, and the brain will pick up on it and go, okay, I get it, I get it, I get it. And then the recall will be there. And so, um, so to your point about like, why does one work better than the other? That, it's just how our brains are wired.
Right. Yeah,
um,
exactly.
and really, I think that goes back to anthropology. Like, when we couldn't write, when we, didn't have an alphabet or printing press, everything was given verbally,
Mhm.
and it was done usually through a story to teach the next generation. Here's how you survive. You do this in the wintertime. You do this in the summertime. Um, this is a good way to live your life. This is a bad way to live your life. Um, so I don't know if that's an evolved process or if we just have always been that way. It really doesn't matter. It's just that's the way we are now because
Yeah.
that's the way we've always been, kind of a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and it's interesting. It's one of those things where it's like, okay, we clearly see that it works. We don't have all of the answers as to why yet. But I mean, but that's going down a whole other discussion into neuroscience and all that, which is not what I at least am remotely qualified to speak about. But I want to kind of switch gears just a little bit, even though I think both of these are kind of semi-related. Um, you know, Over the last few years, we've seen a lot of sort of DIY programs pop up. LegalZoom, TurboTax obviously been around for a while, Robinhood, all that kind of stuff, where lawyers, financial pros, whatever, they're kind of being commoditized more than ever. And I don't know. And as you were talking, I was kind of making these two connections where it's like, I think if small firm owners aren't making that kind of emotional connection, obviously it's a lot easier for people to then to just go to these DIY apps and just kind of do it themselves because they just then see that small firm owner almost equally as a LegalZoom or like, but they don't have to go through a smaller business to do it. They can just kind of handle it themselves on their own terms. Is that a fair connection to make?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Um, so from our standpoint, one of the most important places you can tell your story is on your website because your website tends to be Grand Central Station. Like whether
Mm-hmm.
you're running ads or a billboard or you're in a
Yeah.
magazine, somebody's always going to come to your website first and research you. And we know that this is how people have been doing things since the internet came about. Like 80 some odd percent of people research whatever service or product before they buy it. So
Yeah.
you know, if you're running billboards, they're going to come and they're going to look at your website and go and start to kind of make a decision of like, should I go with this guy or should I go with LegalZoom? Well, LegalZoom is basically going to tell the story of how easy and affordable they are, right? But
Yeah.
so the lawyers in this case need to differentiate themselves away from that and possibly even cast it in a negative light to say, you know, you're not going to get everything you need. You know, your case is probably not going to be resolved to satisfaction, or you're not going to be protected because they're just doing, you know, they're offering like manufacturing, right, where it's
Right.
just mass
Yeah.
production
Yeah.
of these things, and each like let's say it's a will or a trust or whatever that needs to be set up. Well, that needs to be handled by somebody who understands you and what you're doing, and not just a bunch of form fields that somebody that you can fill in and then
Yeah.
hope that they get it right on the other side, right?
Yeah.
You know, because there's clauses, there's, you know, special addendums and all these different things that, you know, trust or a will need to be addressed, and you need to do that with a human, right? So now I'm
Yeah.
starting to tell a story for them about how you need to position yourself,
Yeah.
and point out, you know, the pitfalls of using an automated service like LegalZoom. But you know, at the end of the day, some people are just going to go with that service because of price, right? Like there's just
Mhm.
some people who are going to choose based on price. But I think if you can paint the picture clear enough for them, how much different, you know, working with a real firm is going to be to get ultimately what you want. Um, you know, so this is kind of it's a three-step process, right? You would say, here's the problem with LegalZoom, um, here's how we're going to be better, and here's the transformation on the other side of that. Here's what you can expect. You're never going to be have family members fighting about you know, who should be getting what, because it'll be clear in the document, because you'll actually have a person who will sit down and walk you through that. Whereas LegalZoom is just going to say, what do you want? You're going to fill something in, and that's just going to be in the document, and it could be really vague, right,
Right.
as
Yeah.
to how something's broken up. So
Yeah.
um, there's just a kind of it's me storytelling on the fly. So
Yeah. No, but it's good, you know, because that's what you do, and it's effective. And so, you know, to kind of, you know, play devil's advocate a little bit, because I mean, like right now we're in a spot right now in the marketing world, especially where, you know, still not everyone is taking a storytelling approach, at least, you know, in the industries that we serve. So there's still opportunity to get out ahead of your competitors, really be able to stand out. But what happens in 5, 10, 15 years when the majority of businesses have taken this storytelling approach, and now every business is telling this same story? Because look, they're not going to all work with experts, they're not going to all craft a unique story. You're going to have these businesses who are all telling a similar story. How then can you stand out and make sure that your story truly is unique, and that you're still not, you know, kind of doing what everyone else is doing?
yeah, so well, I have a few thoughts on that. That's a great question. So one, um, look at look at the movie industry, right?
Mm,
You
yeah.
oftentimes have um, movies sometimes that come out like literally around the same time, right? And they're telling the same story. Like Olympus Has Fallen, and I can't remember the other one that had like Jamie Foxx, where he was defending the president from being attacked.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I can't remember the name of it either, but I know what you're talking
Um,
about. Yeah.
and one of those movies did really well, and one of them did okay, right? So the market will decide which story is better, even if they kind of seem the same.
Mm,
But ultimately, it comes down to, at least in my opinion, and obviously I'm biased on this, but if you're working with somebody who is a story expert, or
mhm.
you know, who leads with story, quite often what's going to happen is they're going to come in and they're going to look at your competitors and they're going to go, okay, these guys kind of are telling a story. These guys are telling a story. How do we differentiate your story from their story, right? And so now it becomes a game of differentiation. Even if, let's say, they're all using storytelling, what we, you know, typically see in any industry is a lot of following the pack. So
Yeah.
You see this in design, right? Like where in a certain industry, everybody's website is blue, like banking, right?
Yeah.
So how do we create a different color so that when somebody's looking to get a new bank, they're, they're
Yeah.
like, oh, there was that orange site. I can't remember the other ones because they're all blue. Well, storytelling can be very much the same way. Like, maybe everybody's like, like, hey, we need to have a problem or an inciting incident. We need to provide a solution, and we need to set the stakes, and we need to do this. Well, um, the story consultant is going to be able to come in and go, okay, they're all saying this. We need to say this, right? Here's how we differentiate. We
Yeah.
actually went through this process with a major construction company, where in the construction industry, 20 years, 30 years ago, somebody came up with a brilliant marketing pitch of, we build on time, on budget, and then everybody copied that, and then now it's 20, 30 years later, and everybody's still saying on time, on budget. I'm sure. I saw you laugh, so I'm sure you probably know there's something similar to that in the lawyering world.
Yeah. Well,
um,
also, I also just in the construction world, nothing is ever on time or on budget. And so, like, how believable can that actually be?
well, these are major construction
Right.
companies that they have to follow that. They're not like contractors who are like, yeah, it'll be
Gotcha.
done in
Okay.
a month, and then three months later, it's like, yeah, we're still working on it. Like there's like contingencies set, and like there's a lot of major stuff. We so we worked with this construction company called Abbott Construction. We said, what is the major problem that your customers have? Well, in their case, they're based out of California, so I don't know if this is all every state, but what happens is once you sign the contract to have a building built, you as the person who's paying for it are not allowed on the construction site until the building is done.
Interesting.
So so what happens is a lot of these construction companies come in, they say, "Oh, you need a 5-story building, great." And then they say it'll be done, in 6 months from now, and then you just sit there and you wait and you're like, I don't know if we're on time, I don't know if we're on budget, I don't know because the construction company is not communicating back to the client what's actually happening. You would think they would, but they're like, no, we just got to go get this done, right?
Yeah.
So Abbott Construction came up with this story around like, you're never riding in the back seat with us. You're always up front. We're transparent. We're going to tell you what's happening. And so they moved the conversation away from on time, on budget. They're like, on time, on budget. Like that's like the third thing we're going to do for you, right? Because they've changed the conversation away from that and addressed like what a bigger problem is the anxiety, the fear,
Yeah.
the lack of transparency
Yeah.
that customers are having when they're spending like millions of dollars, right? Like
Yeah.
you don't want to be like spending millions of dollars and then feeling anxious and questioning everything and being confused and in the dark, right? Um, so that's one way. That's just an example that we have from that industry. I can't say that I've worked with a bunch of lawyers. I wish I had, because then I would have a better story to tell you around that. Um, but lawyers, all industries are the same way. There's always um, a kind of like a commonality
Mhm.
in the way that people are approaching the problem, and maybe they're telling a story, maybe not, but they're all kind of saying the same thing regardless. Um, so with like you said, with a consultant uh, or an agency that understands story, they can come in, they can go, okay, everybody's doing this, we're going to do this, and separate away. But the great thing about a story too is that it can be updated. Like you can
Yep.
change a few pieces, you can swap some things in and out. Like you said earlier, maybe you need to. You've got a great story, but it needs a little extra salt, and so we need to punch up the emotion.
Yep.
So you just come in and change a few words around, and all of a sudden, a story can go from being, okay, I get it, to, oh, I really get it, right? Like,
Right.
um, so that's kind of how I would look at that, because you know the great thing about storytelling is there's the formula is the same. It's always the same when it's done well, but you can get to that. You can go through that formula 1,000 different ways. Like that's why Star Wars, follows the hero's journey, but so do westerns, and so do war movies, and so do
Yeah.
romantic comedies.
Yeah.
Like, but they're all very different stories. So
Yeah.
it's not like even if everybody said tomorrow, like we're all we're all in on story. We're all going to use that's how we're going to communicate our message. There's still a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of ways. One of the ways that I describe it is like, you can every every cookie has the same basic ingredients. You need eggs, butter, flour, sugar, right? Maybe vanilla, but then you can put frosting on that cookie. You can put chocolate chips. You can put oatmeal. You can put peanut butter, right? Like they're all
Yeah.
cookies, but they're all different. And so that's how I kind of see storytelling is especially when you either take the time to learn how to do the stuff yourself, or like I said, you hire somebody. Um, you'll realize there's a ton of flexibility, and two people can tell the same story about the same idea, but how they tell that can be vastly different.
Yeah, I agree. So I just realized, and this peek behind the scenes, we didn't renew our Zoom account. So we're going to get kicked off here in about 8.5 minutes. So that's, a little bit of oversight on my part, but we're about to wrap up anyway. I had one more question for you. And just, I hear a lot from people who are like, yeah, I don't really know what my story is. I'm not really that interesting. How can someone at least start taking the first steps to try to figure out what their story actually is?
Um, yeah. So that's a great question. I'm like, there's a bunch of different ways I can answer that. Um, I think the easiest thing to do is just to understand why you got in business,
Mhm.
right? Start there, right? There was something that drove you to becoming a lawyer, right?
Yeah.
Um, and and maybe that was because an event happened in your life, or um, that caused you to want to like help people in that way. Um, Maybe something happened to a family member. Maybe you had an experience. What what drives you every day to continue to want to do what you do. So that is a good starting point. Now that could you probably might need some work to kind of suss that out, but essentially every company, every service, every product that's created solves some sort of problem. And so you as a lawyer, whatever type of lawyer you are solving that problem for your customers. So understand that, understand what drives you, what is your motivation, and then you know most lawyers obviously specialize. Lawyer isn't just a
Yeah.
one size fits all type thing. So um, so understand what drives you, but then also understand what's motivating your customers, right? Why are they coming to you about that specific problem? Talk about that problem. Um, the easiest formula for a story is problem solution transformation, like I mentioned earlier. So what is the problem you're solving? How are you going about solving it? And what can your customers expect on the other side of that problem? Now, that's a basic formula. We would probably use something more advanced if you were working with us, but
Right.
it's a good starting point. Other than
Yeah.
that, I would say, um, you know, buy my book because I actually give away a lot of stuff. We
Yeah.
actually have kind of a Mad Libs thing in the book on how do you
Yeah.
tell a story, so you can kind of go along, and it's like insert verb, insert adjective,
Yeah.
insert noun. And that will start to kind of give you a basic framework to tell your story. And then through the process of telling that story, what happens quite often is people start to add, and they start going, oh, um, I should say this instead of that. I should change these pieces out. And it's like anything. The more you practice it, the better you're going to get at it. But um, you know, you can start with the basic framework. You're not going to knock it out of the park the first time if you're doing it yourself. But over time, that story will advance and improve. So
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. And so that's a good segue here. Talking about your book. Um, I know you said we were talking beforehand. You're giving away the first chapter in that
yeah.
book, if I understood that correctly. How can people get access to that?
Yeah, so if you go to storifyagency.com, Storify is Storify agency.com/center stage. You can download the first chapter of the book. It talks about neuroscience, and you'll also find out if you like my style of writing. I've been told one of the best reviews I got was the person described the book as Deadpool meets Seth Godin. So I thought that was a pretty high compliment.
Yeah.
I don't just drone on and go into the boring aspects of all the neuroscience. I give you kind of like the top level stuff, but I try to teach it in a way that is like a teacher who's actually excited about the content they're teaching, and they want people to really understand it and get it. And so I tell jokes and stories, and so, you know, a lot of people that have read the book have said, I really actually enjoyed this, and most business books are really dry and boring, and this one isn't. And I'm like, yeah, because I actually injected it with personality. I actually follow the stuff that I'm teaching in my book.
Right.
In writing the book. It's very meta.
Love it. Love it. So yeah, storifyagency.com/center stage. You can get that there. That's going to do it. Thank you so much for stopping in, giving us some of your knowledge. You know, can't really talk enough about how important it is to get your messaging right, and taking that story angle to it. It's really going to help you connect better with your audience. That's going to do it for us this week. Continue to rate, review us wherever you're consuming the show. And Seth, thank you once again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. To learn more, go to spotlightbranding.com/center stage.